Good afternoon. My name is Ann McClenahan, and I am the past executive director of the Boston Theological Interreligious Consortium, and currently a volunteer assistant to the director of the Blasey Center for Religion and American Public Life here at Boston College. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this afternoon's webinar discussion entitled Islam in the United States, Issues of Race and Diversity. Before I introduce today's panelists, I'd like to welcome you to ask you to visit the Blasey Center's website, which is at bc.edu/Blasey, and Blasey is spelled B-O-I-S-I. That's where you'll find information about all the work that the center does, including our past and future events, as well as links to our newest initiative, the Religion and American Life podcast. If you'd like to stay in touch with us, please sign up for the mailing list at bc.edu/Blasey. Now let me introduce this afternoon's participants. We are joined by Sahar Aziz, professor of law, Middle East legal studies scholar, and chancellor's social justice scholar at Rutgers University Law School. This academic year, she is at the William and Patricia Clay, am I pronouncing it correctly, Clay? Visiting professor in international law at BU. So welcome to Boston. Professor Aziz's scholarship examines the intersection of national security, race, religion, and civil rights. She has published over 30 academic articles and book chapters, and most recently, she's author of the book, The Racial Muslim, Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. Here's a quick look at the cover. Dr. Abdullah Ali is Associate Professor of Islamic Law and Prophetic Tradition at Zaytuna College in Berkeley, California. He holds a master's and PhD degrees from the Graduate Theological Union, also in Berkeley. His research interests include the interconnection between law and identity formation, comparative Islamic law, and Islam's role in the modern world. I want to mention Dr. Ali's book, The quote-unquote Negro in Arab Muslim Consciousness, published in 2018 by Claritas. Finally, Dr. Omid Safi joins us from Duke University, where he's professor of Sufism and contemporary Islam. Dr. Safi most recently edited and translated the book, Radical Love, Teachings from the Islamic Mystical Tradition, published by the Yale University Press. He's also a regular podcaster on the Be Here Now network. And if you have any tips for us later, please don't hesitate to share them. Dr. Safi leads spiritual-oriented tours to Turkey, Morocco, and other countries, and they're open to all. As you know, today's conversation will explore reasons for continuing anti-Muslim discrimination in the US, and will further investigate forms of discrimination within the American Muslim community itself. Each panelist will have 7 minutes for initial remarks, and then we will move to a more interactive conversation. The last 10 to 15 minutes are reserved for audience questions, so please don't hesitate to add yours to at the Q&A function on the Zoom website. I'd like to ask Sahar to introduce us to today's topic, as discussed in her book, by interrogating how and why the United States, where, as she writes, religious freedom is a founding principle in law and societal norms, yet produces overt prejudice and discrimination against Muslims. Sahar.
Well, first, thank you so much for inviting me. It's such a privilege and a pleasure to be on this esteemed panel. Thank you, Dr. McClenahan, and to the Blasey Center Boise Center for the Study of Religion at Boston College. Thank you to Dr. Abdullah Ali, and thank you to Dr. Omid Safi. Again, my only regret is that we don't get to see each other in person, but I think we're all starting to adapt to this virtual world and trying to exhume the warmth and the connection that comes with the in-person events. But again, thank you so much. It's really an honor for me to be here. So I want to start my comments by explaining to the audience kind of the genesis of the book and then laying out a skeleton, the theoretical frame, in a very brief sense, and then I'm happy to talk more through the discussion. But what led me to this book was actually something very practical. Is I had been focusing on what we call post 9/11 discrimination. It became a term of art, sadly, wherein attorneys like myself and many others who were Muslim Arab South Asians and also those who were allies of those communities were engaging in all sorts of advocacy, public policy and advocacy in DC and also at the state level, and engaging in community organizing, and then also engaging in litigation and trying to stop the government from what we thought were overreaching and abusive practices and abuses of law and authority in ways that targeted Muslim communities and those who were mistaken as Muslims, such as Sikh American communities or Hindu American communities. And of course, when I say Muslim, I mean a very diverse group of people racially and ethnically. And what we found was that each time we would try to use the Equal Protection Clause, which essentially prohibits discrimination based on race and religion and national origin, is the government would argue, well, no, that's not, we didn't select these individuals because they were Muslim. We selected them for national security reasons, which we can't disclose to you because it's secret, state secrets, and it's classified. So we weren't getting very far with the Equal Protection Clause because we had to prove disparate treatment, which means it was intentionally discriminatory. They intended to target that person because they were Muslim. So when in 2011, there was some very impressive investigative reporting that happened at the Associated Press. In fact, I think it ended up receiving a Pulitzer Prize in journalism, which revealed that the NYPD for the last 5 to 6 years, starting in around 2005, 2006, had been engaging in a massive surveillance program against tens of thousands of Muslims in the tri-state area, including at Rutgers University. At the time, I wasn't teaching there, but Rutgers has a very large Muslim community, student population. And also mosques and Muslim-owned businesses or businesses where Muslims tended to congregate socially. And they were phishing. They were sending informants, they were sending undercover agents, and they were phishing for any type of evidence of terrorism. And so it was essentially mass surveillance. So when that happened, we all thought, how do we stop something like this? And there's something called the Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which prevents anyone who receives federal funding from discriminating in their provision of services. And so I thought, well, maybe we could argue that instead of arguing that the NYPD was engaging in discrimination per se, but say that the way they were provisioning their service, the way that they were using the funds that they got from DHS and DOJ was discriminatory by targeting these particular communities. And what the investigative reporter showed is that there really was no rhyme or reason. It wasn't as if they were following a particular terrorist lead. There was just no evidence beyond pure profiling. And when I went to look at Title VI, I discovered that it only covers race and national origin. It does not cover religion. Even though we all knew that Muslims were being targeted in a way that African Americans and Native Americans and Asian Americans and Latino Americans had been targeted for decades. And so essentially, Islam or Muslim identity, to be specific, was being racialized, as opposed to being an identity that was protected by the very First Amendment of the US Constitution, that was protected by social norms that we privilege, right? This country, we're all raised, I was raised here, I went to school here, we're all taught that religious freedom is a fundamental American principle, not much less a fundamental American legal right. So this is not France. right? This is the United States prides itself in religious freedom and religious accommodation. And yet again, Muslims were being targeted and persecuted. And so this is essentially what led me to this project. And so what we were witnessing, again, is a degree and type of profiling that's more closely resembling to systemic racism. Now, government officials, and for that reason, right, because Muslims are being treated as a race, or more specifically a suspect race, government officials and members of the public who may in fact believe in religious freedom norms do not view targeting Muslims in national security and immigration practices as threat to religious freedom, which then led me to much bigger questions. And kind of the book took a life of its own when I was asking, well, is our stated commitment to religious freedom meaningful? Does it apply to all faith communities? And if so, then how do we explain the systematic subordination of Muslim communities across the country? And for multiple years, this wasn't simply backlash. We were now in 2011, 2012, it just kept going. And oftentimes the way that they were subordinated was through physical attacks on and surveillance of their houses of worship, right? The very bastion of where the seat of religion, and all of it under the guise of national security, either by state actors or by private actors. And so herein, the explanation, I believe, lies in the racialization of a minority religious group, which is a process with a protracted and checkered history in the US. And the book kind of goes back, provides a legal history of the way in which Jews, Catholics, and Mormons, I use them as a case study, how they have historically been discriminated, especially during the first 30 to 40, well, the end of the 19th century, and then the first 4 decades, arguably 5 decades of the 20th century. And that in fact, they were legally white, similar to Middle East and North Africans today, yet socially they were not white. And oftentimes that social status of being non-white was on account of their religion. And many of us know about, for example, when Kennedy had to go before the Protestant ministers, when he was running for office for president, and say, my loyalty is to the US, the nation, not to the Pope. That was part of these anti-Catholic prejudices that Catholics were, they were not free thinkers, that they were blindly loyal to the Pope, that they had this foreign loyalty, and that they were unfit for self-governance because they were seen by the Protestant majority as not having the characteristics or the traits that are required for living in a democracy. And we see many of these stereotypes against Muslims. Similarly, Jews were also discriminated against on account of their religion, some of which were theologically based, right, which many of us may know about the conspiracies or the belief that Jews were the ones who killed Christ, and all sorts of theologically based conspiracies, but also the more political conspiracies coming out of the International Protocols of Zion, right, where the Jews are supposedly conspiring to take over the world, that they're conniving, that they're sneaky, that they have this secret society, and that again, they're not loyal to the nation either. They're only loyal to themselves and very clannish, again, based on their religious identity.
I'm going to jump in for a minute.
Okay.
And to keep this moving, I'm sorry to interrupt you because it's fascinating, but I'd like to ask Abdullah to address comments on your argument and perhaps touch on his research, which has been slightly different. He's been looking at how racial antipathy developed in a long process between culturally distinct slices of Islam that have impacted African Muslims, but may also have contributed to some of the discrimination for African American Muslims in the United States. So, Abdullah,
yeah, thank you. All right, thank you. Thank you, Sahara, for the beautiful read, and also, of course, I'd like to thank the Boise Center at Boston College, along with and for having this special panel. You know, it's an extremely important topic, as we all know, and I have to begin by saying that I really, really did enjoy reading the book. As a matter of fact, once I got past the introduction, it was very difficult to put the book down, right? Because it contains so much information about history of discrimination, among other things. But naturally, I do have some questions. There's some things that I felt were unclear or could have been articulated better. And among those things are the sort of the well, I guess probably a good way to begin is to say that I felt like the book reads as if it's something more appropriate for the pre-Trump years, right? Because my impression of the state of Muslims in America now, in particular, the immigrants, we call it quote unquote immigrant Muslims that you're focusing on, seems to be, that at least the Democrats, the left, have embraced Muslims, but embraced Muslims as a race, as you would say, right? Now, not Muslims or Islam as a religion or a religious group, although of course the undertones are there. Of course, Muslims are, they represent the religion of Islam, but I would say that it doesn't appear that the embrace of Muslims is done on the basis of a legitimate respect for our religious tradition. And so it's first and foremost, that was the first thing that the book read as if like it was something that if Trump or prior to the Trump years, right, then this book should have been written, right? At least that's just my impression. The other thing is that your typology, right, of race, I think I found it to be a bit, I guess, frustrating at times in that, the religious, the secular, the dissident, religious and secular, and the former Muslim, and being discriminated against because of their race. And it seems at times that by race, you meant color. Other times it seemed you meant religion. Other times it meant because these people are opposed to the geopolitics of the American state, and I find it difficult to see that as being racialized, right? Because like for one thing I tried to do in my book that she had alluded to was I tried to make a distinction between pre-modern conceptions of race and the modern sort of ideas about race, which really were introduced in the Enlightenment period. And pre-modern races were largely cultural based. It was language meant a lot, custom, sometimes religion, but shared history. Those, define races in that sense. So for instance, we take the Arabs of Arabia, for example. The lexicographers and other sort of Arab historians and other non-Arab historians, when they describe the color of Arabs, they said that the majority of the Arabs were light and dark brown. But they didn't really, that didn't mean that Arabs themselves or those who actually were of a certain color saw themselves as being akin to Africans who may have had the same color, right? So it wasn't like colorism, right? It was, okay, well, we come from the same tribes, from the same area, we have the same history, we have the same culture, right? Whereas all of a sudden in the Enlightenment period, we had this now colorism becomes an extremely important factor in determining what a true race is, So in this sense, it was really frustrating, as I said, looking at your typology and sometimes the examples that you were giving in your book of racialization. And then even the question of whether or not this racialization process happened post 9/11. Of course, you're not completely saying that, but there's a focus, of course, there's somewhat of a focus on what happened after 9/11 because of racialization. I'm not totally sure if that's true. I feel that Muslims have always been racialized, right? Muslims from the Muslim world have always been racialized, and for that very reason, it took all the way until 1965 in order for the floodgates to open up, because prior to that, color or race did have, it played an important role in becoming an American citizen, right? So a lot of people were prevented from becoming citizens because they weren't classified in the right way, right? So in that sense, they were already racialized. And of course, that's not to mention, there are, of course, African Muslims who are here, and so being in America, you're automatically racialized, and so that particular part, I think perhaps deserves some discussion as well. There's some other questions, like I had, like, for instance, and I understand that you're perhaps somewhat invested in this, and I also understand that the effort is partially about trying to create a much more just society, right? And which means that you have to be involved in politics and the issues of law and those type of things. But on one level, I sort of feel that the use of critical race theory as the foundation for bringing about this change may be a little bit, it's a bit divisive in certain ways, as you know. And I would just sort of wondered, like, why would you choose that as the philosophical sort of foundations to solve the race problem or the racism problem, rather than just basic Islamic ideas, right? Quranic teachings, teaching from the Sunnah of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, right? Of course, in those areas where we find that, of course, critical race theory does not cohere with it, right? And one last thing, just one last thing.
Okay, all right.
Last statement, right? So, and this is the last thing is that now, of course, the issue of, like, the different groups of people who are now considered white, which originally were not considered white, they were prevented from inclusion based upon an idea that they did not qualify for self-government, for instance. They didn't have the characteristics that made them, qualify for self-government. I was wondering, like, what your thoughts would be, or rather, did this mean that you believe that no nation has the right to determine requirements for citizenship, and more importantly, for inclusion in a particular polity, which they cherish as something which needs to be preserved, right? In a sense that so there's a desire for the preservation of a certain tradition. Right? Do you believe that in itself is inappropriate for a nation to discriminate? I should say to an extent, in order to preserve what it believes is very special to it, right? And I think that in itself, of course, don't misunderstand me, but I think that this is an important question for us to sort of try to work through, so that's the last thing I have to say. So I apologize for running over time.
No, that's okay. I'd like to now invite Omid to join the conversation. And one of the things I was wondering, perhaps you can touch on, is whether you think Muslim spirituality, which is a great interest of yours, is that, would you say that's also a target of discrimination in the United States? Or is that separate from religion? Is that a separate category? But first, if you would please take up the topic of the book.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you so very much for the invitation, and congratulations, Sahar, on a magnificent book. I very, very much enjoyed reading it closely, and I learned a lot from you. I think what I particularly appreciate is, to me, the strengths of your argument are in two areas. When you are zeroing in on the legal ramifications of the question of the racial Muslim. I might have preferred the racialized Muslim, but the racial Muslim. And then I think when you are also touching on the experience of the Arab Muslim community, which is clearly, I think, at the heart of the book. To that extent, the book is so great that one wishes you could have said everything. And so because of that, I think what you might find me wanting to engage you a little bit is if we take a look at the global Muslim population, okay, 81% or so of the world's Muslims are not of Arab background, though many of them speak some level of Arabic. And in this country that we now call home, earlier on among the waves of Arab immigrants, about half of them were of Christian background and not Muslim, also a significant population of Druze and others. So I think I might want to see the Arab and the Muslim disentangled a little bit. And so to do that, in the few minutes that I have, I might just call attention to the experience of a couple of communities, the African-American community, and the case of some non-Arab, though still transnational Muslims as well. So let me just kind of share my screen a little bit. And I'll skip over some comment on the Ukraine, because the Muslims are always with you. If Jesus says the poor will always be with you, Muslims are always with you. And I would argue that the coverage of the Ukraine is always done with Muslims and Muslim refugees from Syria and Afghanistan as a foil. But let's go, and I want to just play a minute or so of the person that I would argue is the single most prominent American Muslim of the 20th century, namely Malcolm. And Malcolm shows up, I think, in 3 pages of your book. But I think when we're thinking about the conversation of how Muslims become seen as a problem, there is no more essential person that we can turn to.
Malcolm X.
I think a lot of people are confused by the new Arabic name, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz.
I've always had the name on my passport, Malik El-Shabazz, only I only used it in the Muslim world. Well, Hajj is a title that is given to any Muslim who makes the pilgrimage to Mecca during the official Hajj season.
Well, will you now use Shabazz and drop X?
I'll probably continue to use Malcolm X and I'll probably use it as long as the situation that produced it exists.
You don't feel that Shabazz takes the place of X?
My going to Mecca and going into the Muslim world, into the African world, and being recognized and accepted as a Muslim and as a brother may solve the problem for me personally. But I personally feel that my personal problem is never solved as long as the problem is not solved for all of our people in this country. So I remain Malcolm X as long as there is a need to protest and struggle and fight against the injustices that our people are involved in this country.
Are you prepared to go into the United Nations at this point and ask that charges be brought against the United States for its treatment of American Negroes?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes, please.
I think you're right in my opinion.
The audience will have to be quiet.
May God bless him and fill his grave with light. I've never seen another speaker. Maybe Ella Baker is the only other person I've ever seen who actually shushes the audience because when they start clapping for him, because Malcolm says, I'm not saying anything here that deserves to be subject of a clap. I want to call attention to a couple of points that Malcolm raises here and ask us what ramifications they have for our discussion. One of them is he uses the phrase the Muslim world and the African world interchangeably, right? For Malcolm, the Muslim world is not to be centered in the Middle East or even in North Africa. It's really synonymous with the African world. And then he also makes that distinction between the problems that he might have personally and confronted personally with the problems of our people, what we might call systematic, structural, and institutional issues. So I think that's very much moving in the direction of your argument that racism is not somehow a matter of personal prejudice. It connects us to structural systematic issues. I want to think a little bit about this issue of why Malcolm, and what does that say about a number of other figures, and how that gets us into the conversation about the racial Muslim. Let's make a couple of other connections to prominent Black leaders of the 60s. Of course, the later Dr. King, right, in Riverside Church, making that linkage between racism, materialism, and militarism, right? So anti-Black prejudice and the opposition to war and the whole industry of producing warfare is part of King's objection. I think that has a lot to do with the plight of Muslims today. We are on fairly safe ground. I can go on any platform and criticize Iran or Erdogan or Saudi Arabia, which I do, and I'm very likely to get a significant pushback. But if I also make that same critique about US militarism, the reality of America as an empire, or God forbid, Israeli foreign policies, then all of a sudden the charge and accusation of being a radical come my way. So being mindful of the time, you can think of Muhammad Ali's example. He's very much in that same category, racism and war in Vietnam. And where I'd like to stop, and perhaps we can pick this up during the Q&A, is just last observation. I would argue that a lot of the blowback against the American Muslim population, it's not a 9/11 phenomena, though we do see the creation of Homeland Security in many ways as a direct response to Islam and Muslims of a particular variety, but it's actually the continuation of COINTELPRO structures that go back to the 60s, not only to keep an eye on Dr. King and Malcolm X and civil rights leader. Malcolm was not a civil rights leader, but also to keep an eye on suspected communists and anti-war intellectuals and activists. So I would love to see a little bit more continuity between the systems and structures of the 1960s now being applied wholesale to a group of Muslims in a post-9/11 context, and how these become part of the government apparatus under Bush, under democratic administrations, and of course, reaching a particular low point under that despicable orange man.
Sahar, I'd like to give you a chance to respond to, if not all of those thoughts, some of them.
So thank you so much. Those are such thoughtful critiques. And some of them, most of them, not all of them, I certainly struggled with while I was writing the book. All of us on this panel have written books, and we know that one of the biggest restraints is page limits, so that people actually read your book and it's not a treatise. Although maybe my next book, I'll free myself and just write, the 600 pages I really want to write. So there was a crossroad that I hit early on. And I talk about this in the book in the introduction about how to analyze the experiences of African-American Muslims and how to analyze the experiences of what I call immigrant children of immigrant Muslims post-1965, right? Because there are a few facts that I think are pretty clear. The first is the way in which they arrived in this country is very different, right? How long they've been in this country is very different. And to a large extent, not 100%, their way they've been racialized is different. There is certainly overlap, but I don't think it does justice, for example, to the centuries of racialization and subordination and discrimination against African-American communities, to compare that with the subordination of Muslims who immigrated here post-1965. I find that the former is much more severe, much more grave, and much longer, right? Much more protracted. So one of the challenges was how to not erase and not engage in inadvertent erasure of these complex dynamics while recognizing the overlap and the commonalities. And one of the kind of conclusions I came to, which I realize not everybody's going to agree with me, is that African-American Muslims to a large extent in this society. So first, all of us are intersectional, right? We all experience discrimination or subordination at intersectional levels. We have different identities, all of which are subordinated to different degrees, and it is very context specific and era specific. So none of us are I'm not just a woman, I'm not just Muslim, I'm not just Arab, right? I'm an Arab Muslim woman. And even to some extent, I'm an Egyptian Arab Muslim woman. And that could be a very different experience based on the context than someone who's a Pakistani Muslim woman or an Egyptian Coptic male. So I think we understand, right, intersectionality theory. So when considering intersectionality theory, my position is that African-American Muslims are raced primarily as Black, all of the different racial tropes associated with Blackness, and then their Muslim identity intersects with that to create even more complex and sometimes even worse forms of discrimination. Whereas, let's say, I'll use myself as an example, I am rarely raced as Black, right? In the American definition, it's social constructions, I'm agreeing. It's all a social construction, right? And the one drop rule is part of the social construction of Blackness. I am often racialized as foreign, right? My name, the way I look, my heritage, and that tends to have its own, and there are other people who are immigrants or children of immigrants from non-Europe that are also racialized as foreign or permanently foreign. So part of it was trying to kind of think through those complexities, but still identify and see the overlapping forms of subordination. And I cite a lot of people's work who have done brilliant jobs of showing how Muslims who are of African-American identity have been racialized and that are in unique ways. So I just want to be clear that the book was not in any way intended to dismiss or discount or marginalize. It was really more my attempt not to engage in erasure, because otherwise I would really have had to written a book that was double the size, right? Nevertheless, I think both of you know, because you read the book, there is a recognition of how the Nation of Islam, right, in the domestic context, added kind of this layer of American Islam Orientalism, right, of how being a Black Muslim made Islam even more dangerous, and it was kind of this domestic security threat as opposed to this foreign security threat in the Middle East that was controlled and colonized by the French and the British. And so it's not that Islam wasn't viewed as violent or savage or backward, but it was this foreign threat. And it was very much tied to the Middle East and North Africa, and kind of what we think of as that. Not because that's what I think, but because that was kind of the geopolitics of the time. So I just want to kind of put that out there, but I want to, so how does that then affect kind of my topology? Is I agree with you that colorism is a predominant factor, right, in racialization of minorities in the US. Well, I guess what I'm arguing is that what happened starting pre 9/11, but where I think 9/11 was somewhat dispositive, or I don't say dispositive, transformative, but it was building up, it was building up, it was building up, and it would ebb and flow, and it would ebb and flow, and I identified these 7 major events that kind of kept building up on the racial Muslim. And all of these events were international events, except for the World Trade Center bombing of 1993, and then 9/11, which is the creation of Israel in 1948, the Arab-Israeli War in 1967, the Arab oil embargo in 1973, the Iranian Revolution of 79, the Gulf War of 91. Every time, and of course it was the hostage crisis with the Islamic Revolution. So it wasn't just that there was an Islamic Revolution, right? It was that there was a 1-year hostage crisis of US diplomats. But each time these events would happen, and all of them were in the Middle East, and oftentimes because of the US's role somehow, it would create these images of Islam as these violent terrorists, and they were all quote unquote Arab looking, Middle Eastern looking. That doesn't mean that those are the only Muslims that matter. That doesn't mean that those are the only Muslims in the world, much less even the majority of Muslims. It's just more about, this is a very US focused book, intentionally so. It's really trying to understand the social construction of the racial Muslim or the racialization of Muslims in the US. So what I'm arguing is after 9/11, and I do think this is a stark contrast to pre-9/11, your phenotype, what you look like, kind of took a back seat. It's not that it didn't matter, but suddenly your Muslim identity was as dispositive as, say, if you look at the way in which Blackness is racialized, how there's such a heavy emphasis on colorism and phenotype, in other words, physical traits. And I'm arguing that after 9/11, it didn't really matter what you physically looked like. You could be white passing, but if your name was Muhammad, there were these biological like traits imputed upon you that then justified all forms of state action that harmed you, right? Denial of your civil liberties, deportation, surveillance, prosecution, profiling in airports, et cetera, et cetera. And also the public distrusted you. And then some of those members of the public acted on that through violence and through various forms of discrimination. And that doesn't mean that African-American Muslims did not experience that. It's just stating that African-American Muslims have been dealing with discrimination because of their Blackness and their Muslim identity independent of 9/11. It certainly got worse for them too. But I think if we look at the media, if we look at the state practices and the state actions and the elected officials' rhetoric, it was all very much centered around this Arab-looking, Muslim-looking, trope, right? And so that's where people who fit that, based on what they look like or their national origin, or didn't fit that, that's where they might have been affected. And this kind of gets me back to the topology. So no topology is perfect. And the intent of me creating the topology was really to generate this debate and this criticism. It's not me saying this is the right thing, this is the only right analysis. I was trying to get out of the dichotomous paradigm that everybody kept using, which was the good Muslim, bad Muslim. And I thought that wasn't helpful because I just think it's more complicated. And maybe someone can come up with a topology that's even more complicated than mine, right? And I would welcome that. But what the topologies does is it says Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali, you know what they were? They were religious dissident racial Muslims. That's what they were, right? And so they do fit into that topology. And then post 9/11, what does it mean to be a religious dissident? Well, what does it mean to be dissident? Especially if you're a Muslim. Well, it means that you don't support the Iraq War. It means you don't support the occupation of Afghanistan. It means you don't support US foreign policy in the Middle East, including on Israel, including in support of dictatorships, including in blind categorical opposition to Iran and the collective punishment of the Iranian population for decades. Includes you didn't support the sanctions in Baghdad in Iraq against Iraq in the 1990s that effectively starved the entire population while Saddam Hussein was left untouched. It means you don't support us giving all this military aid to Saudi Arabia that is then decimating Yemen and starving its population, right? Those are dissident views. And if you're dissident and you have Muslim identity and you're dissident and then you're religious, that essentially puts you into this category of like, oh, you're either a terrorist or you're susceptible to joining these terrorist groups. You're just one step away, if not outright, a member of ISIS, a member of Al-Qaeda, a member of Hamas and Hezbollah, as if you can't just be religious and dissident and not want to join these groups, right? Because it grants these groups this monopoly over the identity, which is very intentional, right? It's very intentional because it's a form of systemic racism so that we as Muslims can't dissent. Because if we dissent, we essentially invite the theft of our liberty. We're saying we deserve to be surveilled. We deserve to be deported if we're not citizens. We deserve all of these national security repressive policies against us. But if you're a good secular racial Muslim, right? You're not religious, and my secular. What I mean when I say religious racial Muslim and secular racial Muslim. Essentially what I do is I intentionally leave out the word dissident or political. What I mean is it is someone whose politics is, they're either apolitical, they're not involved in politics. There's a lot of people that are like that, right? All over the world. I don't want to get involved in politics. Or they're mainstream politics. Mainstream Republican, mainstream Democrat, just believe in the system, believe in the status quo. So if you're secular and you're apolitical or mainstream, you're essentially the model minority Muslim, right?
Sahar, let me jump in here for a minute. And before we go, because I want to leave time for audience questions, let me just ask one thing before we turn to those, though. What are interventions to this situation? I mean, where do we go from here? Sahar, you talk about in the 19th and early 20th century discrimination and the othering of Jews and Catholics. Are we moving towards, and what interrupts what's going on now in the United States?
Yeah, so I do subscribe to, so one of those critical race, and Professor Ali, I am a critical race theorist, and I'm not a theologian or a philosopher. And so it's so wonderful to hear your perspectives, you and Dr. Safi, because you all this is truly an interdisciplinary conversation. And so I learn so much when I hear your perspective, but I'm limited, right, with my own level of expertise, and I try to kind of stay in my lane. So this was it. I am a critical race theorist, and I was trying to really apply that theoretical frame, which I do subscribe to. But one of the critical race theory principles is progress and retrenchment, right? That every time, because the society is so systemically, because racism or hierarchies is so entrenched in this society, and actually in every society, right? It's just, what's your master category? Is it class? Is it tribe? Is it religion? Is it social constructions of race? So it's not that the US is special. I actually think the US is not special at all, right? I reject American exceptionalism from America being great, the greatest, to America being the worst. I think we're just another country, but our analysis is focused on the US. So progress and retrenchment. I guess what I wanted to say to answer your question is that what we're seeing right now, what we saw after Trump was progress, right? What Professor Ali mentioned, when the turning point, and I say this as somebody who was on the ground, the turning point for the liberals to start finally taking Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism seriously was the Muslim ban. But the reason why I think, and I'm a bit cynical, that thousands of people who were not Muslim showed up to the airports, part of it was, yes, they were offended by the Muslim ban, but I think a larger part was they were disgusted with Trump. And so the timing was perfect, and it allowed then Islamophobia to now become part of the menu item of liberals in all of their, opposition to isms, racism, sexism, etc. So in some ways it was quite fortuitous. And then from there, the younger generation, both Muslims and their allies, said, okay, now we're going to run with this.
Abdullah, you're teaching undergraduates. What hope do you see in that group? You have to unmute yourself.
I'm sorry. Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah. I was just wondering, with you're teaching undergraduates, what kind of things, what kind of interventions do you think might change the future for them?
Well, I mean, this is a religious liberal arts college, so for us, God is at the center. The Prophet Muhammad and his tradition is at the center of it all. So we are a religion of hope, in that sense. I think that the idea of assuming that certain people are biologically determined to act a certain way, that in itself is un-Islamic. And I think that this is one of the things, one of the problems I'm sort of like try to raise about the issue of critical race theory is that even if we may not expressly articulate this, I think that one of the things that makes it difficult for people to be very hopeful is this idea that people are almost never sincere. I agree, largely with the idea that, okay, when many of the people coming to the airports probably were doing it because they hated Trump, right? Rather than them actually liking Muslims or Islam. I actually agree with that, but at the same time, when you see a society as, as somewhat unredeeming, right? And that was one of the things I was looking for as I read through the book, was that I was looking, okay, is there anything redemptive about America? Is there anything redeeming about America? And then at the very last sentence, you finally said something. That was like when the final chapter, I said, okay, well, yes, okay, there is something exceptional, even though you said there seems to be something exceptional about America, right? We can have this conversation. We can actually work through these things. And we have, that America has evolved and has made enormous progress, especially when you compare America to European countries like today, because the problems that we talk about in America, if we were to put our focus on somewhere like France or Germany or Poland and these other places, it's like, well, I don't think there's much of a comparison, but I think it's unproductive to basically say, okay, white people, in particular, say white Anglo-Saxon Protestants are just simply wired to be racist, right? Or just white people altogether, just wired to be racist, right? And they can't really help themselves. That, of course, if you're talking about, you can understand on the state level, sure, the state will utilize these things to keep people divided and control them, right? But when you're talking about individuals in society, all of us are victims of racial stratification. Everyone's a victim of that, right? Because the people up on top, they stratify society, right? And all of us are victimized by it to a certain extent. So for that reason, we can't take the position that these individuals are just determined to be that way. That, in other words, they can't help themselves, right? And that in itself is no different than the Enlightenment period sort of pseudo or the scientific racism regime, that actually we continue to live with. We've never sort of been re-educated to the extent that we actually can develop, a very healthy attitude about one another. So in the last year, I'll just say that, I know I'm taking a lot of time, but because I have to go somewhere. But I feel like a lot of what we talk about as racism is really just simply xenophobia, right? Rather than simply racism, right? So, but maybe we need another session to sort of work these things out, because 1 hour is not enough. So, but I apologize for going for so long.
Right. So Dr. Ali, your comments were on point. I just want to clarify something, because I know there's been a lot of criticism about critical race theory, especially by the far right, which have really been using it as dog whistle politics for something else. Critical race theory, at least my understanding of it, is not that white people are inherently racist, or that white people are that's actually more Nation of Islam, old school white people are devils. That's not critical race theory. Critical race theory just says that because of the history of this country, because of the legal structure, because of everything that has the foundations of the country, it is structured to essentially perpetuate white privilege, whatever white is, and it's socially constructed, especially white upper middle class, right? White and high class or wealth. And then it is structured so to privilege that, and then to disadvantage, kind of collective blackness, whatever that is. And therefore the challenge, the reason why I subscribe to critical race theory is because it forces us and challenges us to then analyze those systems and analyze those structures and ask ourselves, is it doing that? And if it is, how and why? There's a reason why our schools are segregated de facto, not de jure, right? Not by law, but by fact. There's a reason why there's a disproportionate number of African Americans and now increasing Latino Americans that are in prison as compared to their population, right? These are systems of oppression. And so it's not so much that this particular white person or these white people or all white people, it's more the system. And that's where there is some skepticism. I wouldn't even call it cynicism. And some people would say it's realism of critical race theory, but it doesn't make people in power feel comfortable, because if you're not the one on the losing end of that system, then, and you have to examine the system, that means you may have to look and see how you're unfairly privileged and unfairly disadvantaged by the system. And oftentimes people who are in those positions in whatever society, they don't have an interest in changing that.
Right,
Yeah,
I'm going to jump in now. I'd like to let our third participant participate. We have an audience question, and I'll throw it at you, but please respond to anything you would like to at this point. Derek Bell spoke about the notion of interest convergence as how we need to look at progress. Do you have any reaction to that or thoughts about that?
So let me just add a couple of very quick points. One of them is in thinking through these issues of typologies, which I think, as Sahar correctly mentions, they're never perfect, and there's always an ongoing attempt to fine-tune them. But as somebody who's interested in the history of Muslims in America, here's an interesting factoid. in 1955, the FBI commissioned a study of American Muslims in which they proposed pitting the Nation of Islam, Black Muslims, against immigrant Muslims, talking about how the immigrant Muslims are the ones that really have Islam and that they are pacified, they are domesticated, they are peaceful Muslims, whereas the Nation of Islam, they call it the Muslim cult of Islam. So I think we just want to be a little careful when we find ourselves using categories that replicate something that was part of the agenda of the FBI 67 years ago. And in terms of the issue of racialization, I think this is the only thing that I would say. And I really appreciate the insight and the clarity of Dr. Aziz distinguishing between just white folks and systems of whiteness, right? So here's part of the reality that Muslims have been faced with in this country. And Sahar covers this beautifully in the book as well. When transnational Muslims come to America, they do not largely attempt to subvert and radically reconceptualize America into a multiracial democracy. They try to fit in as best as they can, as best as we can, because my own heritage is among these people, to fit in to a racial hierarchy which has white people on top and Black people on the bottom, and they try to fit as close as possible to the white category. That's why they go to the Supreme Court, George Dow, 1914 to 1923, over and over and over again. And what we find so interesting is that the Supreme Court is telling us that whiteness isn't about phenotype. Whiteness isn't just about color. Whiteness is sometimes about religion. And the most hilarious, absurd examples are when Armenians go to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court is deciding based on their Christology whether they classify as white or not, right? So whiteness isn't just about color, though it has elements of that. It's not just about phenotype. It's about this whole mess of a system. And as far as is there any hope or not, and I hope I'm clear about this, if the goal is the preservation of a system in which whiteness, not defined as the color of white people, but whiteness as a system of hierarchy, domination, and privilege is maintained, then obviously not everyone can aspire to that, because you can't have everybody in a multiracial, multi-religious, multi-ethnic, multilinguistic society have access to unearned privilege. The only hope, and I share this with my brother, Dr. Abdullah, we are a people of hope. My own name, Omid, means hope. As people of hope, my hope is the resurrection of an America that has not yet existed, which would not be based on unearned privilege, but that perpetual, never-ending attempt to form the more perfect union. And God bless their soul for having said this, which can only be achieved by pursuing justice.
And that's a beautiful way to end this very short hour. Thank all three of you very, very much on behalf of the Blasey Center. And thank you to our audience for being here with us. And come back for future events. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
It's an honor to be on this panel with all of you.
Same here.
Inshallah, we'll see you. We'll see you again.
Inshallah. And thank you, Sahar, for having written this book.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.